Roose Bolton stood upon the walls of the dread fort with a thoughtful gaze, watching the sky as the gathering storm clouds rolled across the northern horizon. His banners, displaying the flayed man on pale pink, stirred in the cold wind. A hush had fallen over the courtyard below. Men spoke in whispers of the war that raged in the south and of Robb Stark, the young wolf who had named himself king in the north. An uneasy tension hovered in the air, for no one could ignore the uncertain times. Yet the lord of the Dreadfort seemed composed, his calculating mind turning over every possibility. Every moment of his life had prepared him for decisions of cunning and survival, but for the first time in many years, Roose Bolton felt a pang of loyalty stirring beneath his steely calm. Ned Stark, the former lord of Winterfell, had always treated Roose with a mixture of wariness and respect, knowing well the dark reputation of the Boltons. Still, the Starks had allowed the Boltons to hold their lands without suspicion, so long as House Bolton remembered its oath of fealty. Roose understood that there were ways he could benefit from betrayal, for already House Frey had begun to send whispers to many lords about dividing the north and toppling the Starks. He had received ravens from the south, messages of golden promises from House Lannister. But Ned Stark's memory was a powerful anchor that prevented him from jumping at those promises. An oath sworn in the godswood and before the old gods was no small thing. And perhaps, Roose mused, there was a future in serving the rightful king in the north. When he descended the steps into the great hall of the Dreadfort, men parted for him. Standing in the flickering glow of torches, his bastard son, Ramsay, stepped forward with a half-sneer and a glint of anticipation in his eyes. Roose looked upon his son, aware that Ramsay harbored an alarming streak of cruelty. But Roose had never shied away from cruelty if it served his purpose. What was uncertain now was whether Ramsay would understand the subtleties of loyalty. The bastard's cunning and sadism, though often useful, made him unpredictable. Yet Roose's mind was made up. He would send his men to Robb Stark's side. He would hold to the old ways. There was power in that, and, if victory was gained, the Boltons might stand in higher esteem with the new king in the north than they ever had before. Letters went out that very night. Roose summoned the Dreadfort's garrison, wrote instructions for his captains, and called his banners from neighboring lands. The final seal on the parchment to Robb Stark bore the flayed man of House Bolton, but with a single line penned in Roose's elegant hand, the Dreadfort stands with Winterfell. In the war-ravaged Riverlands, Robb Stark held council in the high seat of Riverrun. Catelyn Stark, Lady of Winterfell, stood behind her son, her face drawn with worry and pride in equal measure. Robb was still a boy by many men's reckoning, but he had proven himself in battle. His victories against the Lannisters had won him admiration, and the lords of the North and Riverlands had proclaimed him king. Yet the war was far from over. An urgent hush filled the chamber as the lords around Robb's table listened to dispatches from scouts, rumors of Lannister troop movements, and the whereabouts of Tywin Lannister's main host. When the raven from Roose Bolton arrived, its news was met with a stir of mild surprise. Lady Catelyn read the message, her brow furrowing, then handing it to her son. Robb read it quietly, his jaw tightening. Many in the hall cast anxious glances. The rumors around House Bolton had never been gentle, and Roose's cunning was the stuff of whispered tales. Yet the letter's promise was clear. House Bolton reaffirmed its fealty to Robb and was marching south to join him. A new hush fell as Robb spoke the words. Roose Bolton swears loyalty to the king in the north. He marches with 3,000 men. A sense of relief spread among the gathered lords. Talhart, Serwyn, and Umber exchanged guarded looks. The Boltons were always regarded with caution, but in a war as desperate as this, every banner counted. And the notion that Roose Bolton would stand with them provided more hope than fear. Robb, trying to project the confidence required of a king, nodded and said, "Then let him come. If he proves true, the North grows stronger." Against that backdrop, the battles continued. Lannister outriders tested the Stark lines in the Riverlands, and the news from King's Landing was dire. Ned Stark had been executed, King Joffrey Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, and Tywin Lannister was summoning a great host. Yet, despite the heartbreak and the thirst for vengeance, Robb Stark did not lose sight of what truly mattered. He had to keep the North united. House Bolton's arrival was soon followed by smaller banners from other corners of the North, knights who had been delayed, or lords who had marched slowly for fear of crossing the Twins. The Great John, the Blackfish, and others advised Robb on how to deploy these new forces. When Roose Bolton finally arrived, his meeting with Robb Stark was cordial, if a touch uneasy. Robb studied the pale-eyed man across the high table in Riverrun's great hall. Roose spoke softly, showing neither humility nor arrogance. He reaffirmed his loyalty to Winterfell, saying that while House Bolton had heard many rumors and offers, no gold could buy an oath sworn in the old gods' names. "We are yours, your grace, in life and death," he intoned quietly. Robb, reminded of the weight of leadership, quietly inclined his head in thanks. Lady Catelyn, for her part, watched Roose with a mother's caution. She forced a polite smile, acknowledging that the cause needed every ally, especially an ally with cunning enough to thwart the Lannisters' designs. The war moved quickly. At the Whispering Wood, Robb's tactics and the ferocity of the northern men led to victories that echoed throughout the realm. Tywin Lannister split his forces in an attempt to outflank the northern host, but the deep knowledge Roose Bolton had of ambushes and infiltration worked to the Starks' advantage. Where once there might have been a plan for betrayal, there was now an eagerness to show cunning in service of the king in the north. Bolton's men excelled at night raids and silent kills, terrorizing Lannister outriders who ventured too close to the fords of the Red Fork. Lord Bolton had no illusions that winning the war would be easy, but he took satisfaction in the knowledge that the North was winning renown, forging its own power. The men who marched under his banner showed no mercy to any who threatened Stark armies. In the days following these victories, war councils were held with greater frequency. Word came from the Westerlands that Tywin Lannister had regrouped near Harrenhal. Another message reached Robb. The Baratheon brothers were at odds, with King Stannis on Dragonstone claiming the Iron Throne for himself, and King Renly in the Reach mustering a grand force. The lords around Robb debated where the North should stand in this growing conflict. Some insisted it was best to remain solely focused on the Lannisters, to carve out the independence of the North and the Riverlands. Others suggested that Stannis Baratheon's claim was the stronger by law, and that forging an alliance with him might eventually secure a greater peace. Roose Bolton, softly but clearly, advised that if the king in the north desired allies, it would be best to deal with the more single-minded of the Baratheon brothers. "Stannis is not a man of feasts or flatteries. He is a man of iron. If we could but see a path to cooperation, we might end this war more swiftly than expected," Roose said. His words lodged in Robb's thoughts, though the king made no firm commitment. Meanwhile, the Freys remained an uncertain ally. Walder Frey had only grudgingly granted passage across the Twins early in the war. Rumors swirled that he fumed at Robb for any perceived slight or oversight. Yet, in this changed timeline, one crucial difference emerged. Without Roose Bolton's secret plotting or overtures from Tywin Lannister, Walder Frey found fewer paths to betrayal. As Robb had never openly scorned the Freys, indeed, he had attempted to honor them in the best ways he could. There was no immediate cause for the bitterness that would lead to something as catastrophic as the Red Wedding. The seeds of mistrust might have remained in Walder's heart, but the old man's calculations were governed by advantage. With Bolton standing firmly behind the Starks, Walder Frey suspected that turning cloak would be unwise. As the seasons turned and battles raged, Robb's leadership steadily became tempered by experience. He lost dear friends on the battlefield. He witnessed the destruction of towns in the Riverlands. He took counsel from his mother, from the Blackfish, from Roose Bolton, and from other loyal lords. Ever haunting him was the memory of his father's execution and the knowledge that Sansa remained a captive in King's Landing. He also grieved for his sisters, Arya, missing somewhere to the south, and the young Rickon in the uncertain safety of Winterfell. But in all that sorrow, Robb found a sense of purpose. He learned to harness the love and loyalty of his men in ways only a Stark could. On a quiet evening, while camped near the Twins, Robb was introduced to a young noblewoman from House Westerling, named Jane. Catelyn and several northern lords could see Robb's admiration in his eyes from the moment he spoke to her. In another story, this budding romance might have sparked tensions, especially with Walder Frey's desire to see Robb betrothed to one of his brood. But the trust that Robb had begun to foster among his allies, and the unwavering support of Roose Bolton's men, gave him a certain confidence. Rather than concealing his marriage to Jane after a moment of weakness, Robb approached the matter with more care. He still felt compelled by honor. He had once pledged to consider a Frey bride, but he sensed that forging a marriage with Jane Westerling, a lesser Westerland's house, might yield an important gesture. Some in the West might see that the Starks could show mercy and acceptance to those who turned against the Lannisters. Behind the scenes, Walder Frey grumbled, but Roose Bolton's presence in Robb's war councils dissuaded him from sending secret letters to Tywin Lannister. Or, if Walder did send them, they met with little success, for Tywin's spies already whispered of House Bolton's unwavering loyalty. The path to betrayal that existed in that other timeline, the path that ended in a blood-soaked red wedding, now stood blocked by the United Northern Command, by the quiet cunning of Roose Bolton used in service to the Starks instead of against them. In time, the king in the north realized that he could not simply wage war in the Riverlands forever. He needed to press the Lannisters where it hurt the most, in the heart of their power. Moreover, Robb knew that House Tyrell had thrown its weight behind King Renly Baratheon. The possibility that Renly might overwhelm King's Landing and claim the Iron Throne loomed large. If that happened, the Starks would lose any chance of negotiation for Sansa's freedom, and perhaps risk new enemies. Yet, only days later, a raven brought stunning news. Renly Baratheon had been slain under mysterious circumstances in his encampment. His bannermen, adrift, seemed ready to join forces with Stannis, if Stannis could gain their favor. That was the rumor swirling about the campfires. Stannis, now arguably the stronger Baratheon claimant, turned his eyes upon King's Landing. But the Lannisters, cunning as ever, held the capital in a firm grip. Robb recognized a chance. He convened a secret council with Roose Bolton, the Great John, the Blackfish, and Lady Catelyn to discuss seeking an alliance with Stannis. Bolton's voice was calm as ever, offering that Stannis was a man of relentless determination. To appease him might be easier than to dethrone him once he took King's Landing. Lady Catelyn, for her part, hesitated, reminding Robb that forging an alliance with Stannis might compromise the North's claim to independence. But Robb, older now than when he first called his banners, balanced the words. "Independence is essential," he said quietly. "But we cannot allow the Lannisters to remain in power. And if Stannis sits the Iron Throne, perhaps he will allow the North its freedom in gratitude for our help. If he does not, we will have to force his hand. But we cannot fight the entire South alone." The decision to reach out to Stannis Baratheon, though risky, was made. A raven was dispatched, carrying Robb's words of tentative friendship and the possibility of mutual gain. The message spelled out that if Stannis recognized the king in the North's rule over the lands of the ancient kingdom, the North would stand with him against the Lannisters. In exchange, Robb would vow not to assault the Crownlands or hamper Stannis's efforts to claim the throne. As the days turned to weeks, more fighting roiled the Riverlands, but the Red Wedding never came. The Freys grumbled, but with Walder's potential conspirators uncertain and Bolton standing firm, there was no easy means for the old man to enact a betrayal that guaranteed him more power. No hush of horns in the middle of a wedding feast, no musicians drawing crossbows, no knives in the dark. Instead, the northern host continued to bolster its ranks with smaller lords, forging alliances with those who had reason to resent the Iron Throne. At Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister consolidated his forces, uncertain whether the Stark host would move south toward the capital or attempt to push into the Westerlands. Scouts reported that Tywin was massing men, determined to hold the strategic fortress. Every day, ravens flew between Harrenhal and King's Landing, where Queen Regent Cersei Lannister clung to power through her vicious son, Joffrey. If the young king was unsettled by the growing strength of the North, he did not show it in public, but his advisors whispered that time was running short. Stannis would soon march. Amid this swirling chaos, House Bolton's presence in the Stark councils continued to prove beneficial. Where the Great John advocated a head-on clash, "Beat them with northern steel, lad," he would say, Roose urged caution and subtlety. Strike where they are weakest. Threaten them where they do not expect. Make Tywin doubt his every move, Lord Bolton advised in his soft voice. The result was that Robb Stark alternated between swift strikes and cunning feints, marching and then disappearing into the northern hills of the Riverlands before the Lannisters could trap him. Bolton's men performed night raids that kept Tywin on edge. Time stretched onward, but the sense of dread that overshadowed the war began to shift, replaced by a cautious hope that the Starks might actually come out on top. News came at last from the Stormlands. Stannis Baratheon had engaged in a pitched battle against remnants of Renly's loyalists and brought them to heel. He was rumored to be preparing ships for an assault on King's Landing. Robb's message was finally answered. A raven arrived in the Stark camp, sealed with the stag and flaming heart sigil of King Stannis. The message was terse and direct. Stannis recognized that the boy in the north claimed independence, but if Robb Stark truly wished to see the Lannisters undone, let him prove it in battle. Let him draw Tywin Lannister's main host away from King's Landing so Stannis might strike at the city unopposed. In return, once Stannis claimed the Iron Throne, he would formally acknowledge the king in the North's rule over the lands once held by Torrhen Stark. Press Tywin Lannister hard, the note concluded, or be prepared to stand aside as I march to my rightful seat. Robb shared the note with his council. Immediately, the Great John whooped at the thought of a glorious battle. Roose Bolton merely nodded, as if this was what he had expected all along. Catelyn Stark looked worried, but also recognized that their position had improved. If Stannis was good to his word, then the North need not remain yoked to the Iron Throne. The only cost would be further bloodshed, but that cost seemed inevitable in any event. The next weeks were a tumult of preparation and march. Rather than keep the safety of Riverrun, Robb moved his host in a bold thrust toward Harrenhal, hoping to draw Tywin Lannister out. Spies reported that Tywin, hearing of Stannis's intention, had no choice but to respond. If he ignored Robb Stark, he risked losing Harrenhal and the Riverlands entirely. Yet Tywin's caution was legendary, and the towering blackened walls of Harrenhal were no easy prize. On the eve of the confrontation, Robb sought Lord Bolton's counsel once more. They stood near the war map spread across a table in a commandeered keep. Bolton pointed to the wide swamplands around Harrenhal. "This castle is cursed," he said softly. "A monstrous place, but it is also large enough to hold a massive garrison. If you can lure them into the fields outside the walls, your cavalry will have an advantage." He suggested smaller tasks. Have archers in the trees, men to set fires in the night. The key was to pry the Lannisters out of the fortress, forcing them to fight on uncertain ground. Robb studied the plan, his brow furrowed, but he gave a slow nod. This was a risk, yet it might be the blow that forced Tywin's entire army to shift, and thus open a path for Stannis to King's Landing. In the dawn light, the northern host and its Riverlands allies arrayed themselves within sight of Harrenhal's looming walls. The old fortress stood like a burned-out giant, a testament to the cruelty of Aegon's conquest centuries before. Banners of the wolf, the Tully fish, and the flayed man of Bolton fluttered in the breeze. Across the field, horns sounded as Lannister outriders reported the northern presence. Tension crackled in the air. Robb Stark, astride his gray direwolf sigil cloak, glanced at his mother. She stood by with the other ladies, watching from a slight rise with a small guard. Lady Catelyn's heart pounded as she prayed to the old gods to protect her son. Nearby, the Great John roared his northern war cries, brandishing his sword. Roose Bolton's men waited in grim silence, their lord wearing a calm, near-blank expression. The hours that followed tested the steel of both armies. At first, Tywin Lannister did not show himself, sending out cavalry skirmishers to probe the Stark lines. But Roose Bolton's men countered with swift retaliation, drawing the Lannisters deeper away from the fortress. Soon, a full-scale engagement erupted. The clangor of steel filled the air, and the ground churned with mud and blood. Robb led his personal guard in a cavalry charge against the Lannister flank, forcing them to reevaluate their position. Among the chaos, Roose Bolton directed his archers to unleash volleys into any Lannister units that attempted to retreat toward Harrenhal's gates. Slowly, inexorably, the battle spilled away from the blackened fortress walls and into the open fields where Stark cavalry could maneuver more freely. For hours, the struggle teetered on a knife's edge. Men fell screaming, war horses tumbled, and horns blared. But Robb's men had an advantage in morale, for they fought under the banner of the king in the north, determined to avenge the death of Ned Stark and the injustices done to their land. The Lannisters, cunning though they were, found themselves flanked on one side by the swirling mists of the riverlands wetlands and on the other by Bolton's archers. Finally, when the sun dipped low and the air turned thick with the stench of sweat and blood, Tywin Lannister himself appeared at the head of a last desperate push of heavy cavalry, hoping to crush the Stark center. In that moment, Robb's wolfish cunning shone. He had anticipated this move and had kept the Greyjoy's fearsome Umber foot soldiers in reserve, hidden behind a small copse of twisted trees. The Umbers emerged with thunderous cries, smashing into the Lannister cavalry's flank. Caught between the Umbers and Robb's center, Tywin's final push broke. Trumpets sounded the retreat. Harrenhal, battered and disorganized, did not open its gates fast enough to shelter all the Lannisters. In the darkness, the Stark host lit torches and advanced on the fortress. Seeing the hopelessness of their situation, the garrison inside eventually surrendered. Tywin, wroth but unbowed, gathered the remnants of his broken force and slipped away into the night, heading eastward, perhaps hoping to reach King's Landing before Stannis. But Stannis Baratheon had already set sail. By the time Tywin realized the extent of his predicament, Stannis was hammering on King's Landing's gates, his ships blockading Blackwater Bay. With fewer defenders than in the timeline of despair, King's Landing found itself vulnerable. The cunning wildfire defenses arranged by Tyrion Lannister still posed a threat, but without Tywin's full support, the capital wavered. A furious battle broke out on the Blackwater. Yet, in this altered history, Stannis's might was greater and his caution more pronounced. Rumors whispered that Stannis's Red Priestess had foreseen the danger of wildfire. Rather than drive headlong into the trap, Stannis's forces approached by land and sea with calculated tactics, mitigating the devastating effect of the green flames. Back in the Riverlands, Robb's men secured Harrenhal, capturing scores of Lannister soldiers. From them, Robb learned that King's Landing was under siege. A hush of possibility enveloped the northern host. If Stannis succeeded in taking the city, it might mean the end of Lannister power. Then the North could lay out its demands for Sansa's release, for retribution, for recognition of the North's independence. The question remained whether Tywin could rally. Robb's advisors debated pressing eastward, trying to block Tywin's route to the capital, while Stannis closed in from the south. The Great John wanted another clash, but Roose Bolton cautioned that Tywin might slip away or lead them into a trap. "We have the advantage of position," Bolton pointed out. "Harrenhal is a fortress that gives us a vantage over the Trident. Tywin cannot force a march to King's Landing without crossing near us. Let him come to us." Robb agreed, seeing the wisdom in it. So they settled in to hold Harrenhal and the surrounding fords, awaiting Tywin's next move. Weeks stretched on. News arrived that Stannis had fought his way through King's Landing's defenses, capturing much of the city's outer walls. The Red Keep was under siege. Queen Regent Cersei and King Joffrey were rumored to be holed up inside. Starvation and fear gripped the people of the city. Tyrion Lannister, famed for his strategic mind, was rumored to be leading a last-ditch effort, but with the full might of the Tyrells no longer present, since Renly's death had scattered them, and Tywin's armies badly mauled at Harrenhal, there was little hope for the Lannisters. Catelyn Stark prayed for her daughter Sansa within the city walls. She could only pray that the girl would be spared in the chaos. The tension weighed on Robb, who considered sending envoys to Stannis to negotiate Sansa's safety before any final assault on the Red Keep. Yet fate often moves faster than letters. Before any envoy could return, a fresh raven arrived. King's Landing had fallen. Stannis Baratheon was victorious, sitting upon the Iron Throne. Cersei and Joffrey were taken captive, presumably to face justice or given Stannis' temperament, a harsher fate. This event sent ripples throughout the realm. Men spoke of it in hushed tones. A new king sat the Iron Throne, one who had no love for traitors or oathbreakers. Rumors abounded of those who pled for mercy, and those who received none. Even so, Stannis was not a man of wanton cruelty. He was known for his harsh sense of justice. It was said that he had limited the chaos in the city to the best of his ability, punishing looters and seizing certain nobles who had conspired with the Lannisters. A swirl of confusion seized the capital. Houses and families scrambled to pledge fealty, hoping to save themselves from ruin. In this moment, Tywin Lannister, traveling east with a battered host, found himself between two powerful adversaries. Robb Stark controlling the Trident Crossing and Stannis Baratheon in the capital. Whispers suggested that Tywin might attempt an alliance with the Tyrells to strike at Stannis from the south. But the Tyrells, stung by Renly's death and uncertain of how best to keep their power, hesitated. Many had lost faith in forging alliances with a losing cause. The cunning spider, Varys, was rumored to have advised Stannis on which lords might be swayed, and so the Tyrells eventually opened negotiations with the new king on the Iron Throne. Tywin stood alone. At Harrenhal, Robb held council with his lords once more. A new raven had arrived from King Stannis, offering recognition of the king in the north if Robb would unite with Stannis to end the last of the Lannister threat. In addition, Stannis demanded that Robb deliver Tywin Lannister into his hands if captured. He is guilty of treason, of orchestrating murders, and of leading war against the rightful king. The letter read in a severe, clipped tone. It was also rumored that among Stannis' demands was the release of Sansa Stark into Robb's care. Once Tywin was defeated, Robb felt conflicting emotions swirling in him. There was relief that Sansa might be free, that the war might soon end, but also a deep anger that Tywin still lived, that so many had died for this cause. Roose Bolton and the other northern lords looked to Robb for leadership. As king in the north, he had to decide whether to commit to a final push against Tywin or remain in Harrenhal, content to let Stannis handle the last Lannister army. But Robb recognized that if he left Tywin unchecked, the north might face future retaliation. Vengeance still burned for the deaths of Ned Stark and so many others. So Robb resolved to ride out, to find Tywin's force and either shatter it in battle or force it to surrender. That would be the final blow to break House Lannister's hold on power. Then the realm could begin to heal, with the north free and independent. The final campaign began. Guided by Roose Bolton's spies, the Stark host moved swiftly, crossing the Trident near the Ruby Ford where legends said Rhaegar Targaryen had fallen to Robert Baratheon. Robb's mind wandered at times to the tragedies that had befallen the realm because of a single king's cruelty, Aerys the Mad, and wondered if they were simply repeating old cycles. But he pushed those doubts aside. He was a king now, and he had a duty to fulfill. Tywin Lannister, cornered, still had a formidable force. He set up a defensive camp near the Blackwater Rush, hoping to keep an escape route open to the south. Yet the odds against him were overwhelming. Robb commanded near equal numbers, and the men of the north were hardened by the Riverlands campaign. Further, Stannis' outriders ranged to the south, cutting off any chance Tywin might have had to retreat to the Westerlands. In the hush before dawn, a Lannister messenger approached Robb's lines under a white flag, bearing a proposal. Tywin would retreat peacefully if allowed to keep all Lannister lands in the Westerlands, ceding the Riverlands entirely. He would also free Sansa Stark if the king in the north so demanded, apparently out of his own means. But even the messenger looked uncertain, for Sansa was known to be in King's Landing with Stannis. Tywin's desperation was palpable. Robb Stark listened, measuring the words. He remembered all too well that Tywin had orchestrated the war that led to Ned's downfall, that the Lannisters had shown no mercy. He knew Tywin to be a proud man, one who would likely betray any peace once he'd regained strength. Standing among his lords, Roose Bolton, the Great John, the Blackfish, Catelyn, and others, Robb calmly declared that he would not grant safe passage to Tywin Lannister. "My father was shown no mercy," Robb said. "Nor my sisters, nor the Riverlands. House Lannister must answer for its crimes." And with that pronouncement, the men of the north prepared to fight. When dawn broke, the final confrontation began. For all his cunning, Tywin was outmaneuvered. The battlefield along the Blackwater Rush was constrained, the Lannister lines pinned by the river on one side and the rolling hills on the other. Robb's cavalry hammered at Tywin's wings, while Bolton's men harried the rear. The Great John led the vanguard in a furious assault, roaring the Stark war cry. Tywin's men fought bravely, but they were weary, outnumbered, and disheartened. One by one, Lannister units broke. Tywin attempted a desperate stand in the center, but a wave of northern horsemen crashed into his lines, scattering them. By midday, the Lannister host was in ruins. Tywin himself, flanked by a handful of loyal guards, refused to flee. He was captured, disarmed, and brought before Robb Stark. Silence fell over the battlefield as Robb and Tywin stood face to face. The Lord of Casterly Rock was battered, blood-stained, and furious. His cold eyes bored into the young wolf. In another world, Tywin might have orchestrated a grand betrayal that ended with Stark blood spilled in a wedding hall. But in this one, the advantage was Robb's. "You have lost," Robb said, his voice thick with emotion and grief. Tywin Lannister met his gaze unflinchingly. He did not beg, but he demanded terms, as though he still had the power to shape them. "Do with me what you will," he said, "but House Lannister will endure." In that moment, Robb thought of all the families shattered by this war. He thought of his father's quiet dignity and how Ned Stark would have handled such a moment. Perhaps Ned would have dispensed justice, but also tempered it with mercy. The memories of his father's execution, of the hardships inflicted on the north, of the riverlands, were too fresh. "You are a prisoner of the king in the north," Robb said at last. "Your fate will be decided in good time." Then he turned to his men and gave the order to treat the wounded and secure the prisoners. Tywin Lannister was led away in chains. A great cheer rose from the northern host, for the final threat in the field had been defeated. The war was not necessarily over. There remained skirmishes, pockets of Lannister resistance in the Westerlands, the uncertain loyalty of other houses. But the principal foe was vanquished, and a new age beckoned. Robb Stark took counsel that evening, verifying that King Stannis was aware of their victory. He intended to bring Tywin Lannister to King's Landing to face the justice of the Iron Throne. Though Robb was determined not to deliver his prisoner without ironclad assurances that Sansa would be returned to him. Weeks later, under the watchful eye of Roose Bolton and other northern lords, Tywin Lannister was escorted into the capital. King Stannis received them in the Red Keep's throne room, the Iron Throne behind him. Firelight danced off the polished metal swords that had been fused by Dragonflame centuries ago. The city was still reeling from its recent siege, but there was no question that Stannis was king here. The usual courtiers had thinned, replaced by men loyal to the Baratheon cause. The Red Priestess, Melisandre, stood at Stannis' side, her bright red robes a stark contrast to the dour atmosphere. Roose Bolton observed everything in his typically quiet manner. He found the tension between Robb Stark and King Stannis as tangible as the cold air of the north. Stannis' manner was as rigid as rumor suggested. He thanked Robb for capturing Tywin, but made no secret that the Lannister lord must be tried as a traitor. At the same time, Stannis accepted the documents presented by Robb, stating the North's terms for recognition. After all, a pact was a pact, and Stannis, for all his severity, prided himself on his sense of justice. The release of Sansa Stark was arranged, though it took time to locate her among the turmoil in the city. When they did reunite, the sight of Robb embracing his younger sister brought tears to Catelyn's eyes. The girl looked thin and frightened, but relief shone in her face. Finally, King Stannis affixed his royal seal to the parchment that recognized the North's independence. "So it is agreed," he declared in his flat, unyielding voice. "The North shall be a realm unto itself, so long as you keep to your own governance and do not seek dominion south of the neck." Robb bowed his head in acknowledgement. The moment was both triumphant and bittersweet. For centuries, the North had been part of the Seven Kingdoms. Now it was free, but only after a bloody war. Robb felt the burden of so many sacrifices weigh upon his shoulders. He was king, yes, but at what cost? The justice meted out to Tywin Lannister was harsh. Stannis had him tried for treason, for orchestrating the murder of innocents, for the war he waged against the rightful king. Robb, as a personal courtesy, was given the chance to speak about Ned Stark's execution, but that was at Joffrey's command. Tywin maintained, in his own defense, that he was protecting his family's interests, that Joffrey had been crowned king by the laws of the realm. His arguments fell flat in the face of Stannis's unwavering sense of legitimacy. The trial ended with a royal decree of execution. The method was swift and public. Tywin Lannister, who had once been the most feared man in Westeros, knelt before the Iron Throne, and Ser Davos Seaworth, whom Stannis had named Hand of the King, read out the charges. In the hush, Stannis pronounced sentence, and with one stroke of the executioner's sword, Tywin's life ended. It was a shock to all who watched, for Tywin had so long loomed large over the realm's politics. But with his death, the War of the Five Kings effectively reached its conclusion. On the streets of King's Landing, the small folk looked upon the new king in the north with curiosity and, in some cases, gratitude. Rumors spoke of how the northern armies had not sacked the city, of how they had sought only to rescue Ned Stark's daughter. Some even whispered that a new age of peace might be dawning. Of course, others believed it was but another turn of the wheel, and that future wars were inevitable. But for now, at least, a measure of relief settled over the realm. The North withdrew, taking its armies and its newly recognized independence. Stannis remained to consolidate his hold over the Crownlands and the southern regions. When Robb Stark finally led his men northward, he carried Sansa in his party, along with Lady Catelyn, the Blackfish, and other northern lords. The Great John roared victory songs. Roose Bolton rode at a measured pace, silent in his own thoughts. Ramsay Snow, still a bastard, followed along, quietly exulting in the violence he had witnessed and facilitated, but also aware that his father's loyalty to House Stark had proven wise. The Dreadfort had gained standing in this new age, with Roose regarded as one of Robb's most cunning and capable lieutenants. The journey back to the north was long. They passed through the war-torn riverlands, where Edmure Tully and Brynden the Blackfish were working to rebuild the ravaged countryside. Many small folk cheered Robb as he went, hailing him as the Wolf King who had ended the tyranny of the Lannisters and secured independence for the North. Robb, chastened by the horrors he had seen, accepted the cheers with a solemn nod. Lady Catelyn parted ways at Riverrun to remain for a time with her brother Edmure, helping to restore order to her ancestral lands. She trusted Robb to lead the Northmen home. Crossing the twins proved surprisingly easy, for Walder Frey, though sullen, dared not defy the newly legitimized king in the north. He greeted Robb with a forced courtesy, grumbling about lost opportunities but offering bread and salt, reaffirming that the days of crossing the Frey Causeway at a price were behind them. The illusions of grandeur Walder might have harbored under Tywin Lannister's promises had evaporated in the face of Stannis's victory and the unstoppable tide of the north. As the host crossed into the north proper, the bitter winds and the towering pines felt like home. Robb took in a deep breath of the crisp northern air. Grey wind padded at his side, the great direwolf that had seen him through so many battles, now a silent guardian. Sansa rode in a closed litter for much of the journey, slowly recovering from the trauma of King's Landing. Sometimes she emerged, turning her gaze upon the snowy fields and distant mountains, tears glistening in her eyes at the sheer relief of being home. Roose Bolton took his leave from the main column near the last river, returning to the Dreadfort to secure his own lands. At the parting, he bowed low before Robb. "Your Grace, House Bolton remains yours to command," he said softly. Robb thanked him, acknowledging the vital part the Boltons played in their victory. Perhaps the day would come when they would share more cordial relations than any Stark-Bolton tie had in the past. For now, there was mutual respect. When at last Robb and his companions reached Winterfell, grief and hope battled in their hearts. The castle had suffered no sacking in this timeline. Theon Greyjoy's betrayal was never fully enacted because Theon, hearing of the major shift in the war, had reconsidered or been dissuaded by the knowledge that the Boltons were firmly allied with Robb. Or perhaps he had been captured or had chosen a different path. In any case, Winterfell still stood unburnt. The gates opened to welcome the king in the north home, though there were tears for the absent Ned and for the unknown whereabouts of Arya. Even so, there was joy in reuniting with little Rickon, who had been kept safe in the castle by the loyal men of the north. A feast was held in the great hall, though it was a subdued affair compared to more lavish celebrations. Northern lords came to pay homage to their king, to hail him for winning their freedom. Among them was Roose Bolton, who journeyed from the Dreadfort once more at Robb's summons, to share in the words of thanks. Robb insisted on making a public acknowledgement of Bolton's loyalty, naming him the Cunning Shield of the North for his counsel during the war. Boltons and Karstarks, Umbers and Mormonts, all of them joined in a moment of unity. From the high seat of Winterfell, Robb Stark looked out at the assembled lords and ladies, a mixture of gratitude and responsibility settling on his shoulders. He remembered how close betrayal had come to toppling all of them, how in another turn of fate, the Dreadfort might have sold them out to the Lannisters. But not in this story. Here, House Bolton had remained loyal. Here, the Red Wedding had never taken place. And here, the North had earned its freedom alongside an alliance with King Stannis. As time passed, the North set about the work of healing and rebuilding. Fields needed tending, roads needed patrolling, and there was an entire generation of orphans and widows to consider. Robb, determined not to let his father's legacy fade, held open courts where even small folk could petition the king in the north for redress of grievances. Sansa remained at Winterfell, slowly regaining her confidence, discovering she had a role to play in the new northern court. More ravens arrived from King's Landing, bearing Stannis's sealed communications. Most were requests for logistics, trade, and the resolution of smaller border disputes. Stannis had no interest in coddling the North, but he also had no desire for further war with them. In that mutual respect lay the seeds of a lasting peace. And what of House Frey? Walder Frey, sullen and fearful of losing everything, had to toe the line of the new realm's order. The twins remained crucial for trade and travel, but Walder found his influence diminished. He muttered about lost marital alliances, that the king in the north had not married one of his granddaughters. Yet without the spark of betrayal and the lethal cunning of a Bolton-turned traitor, Walder Frey had never been emboldened enough to orchestrate the horror that would have gone down in infamy as the Red Wedding. Life went on, albeit with Frey resentment simmering behind forced smiles. Across the rest of Westeros, the aftermath of the war rippled. The Westerlands fell into disarray with no Tywin to maintain order, and many lesser houses squabbled for power. King Stannis moved to bring them in line, sending loyal men to restore a sense of royal oversight. Cersei and Joffrey languished in cells, their fates uncertain, though rumors said Stannis would soon hold a trial that might end in their executions. Tyrion Lannister had vanished under mysterious circumstances, or so some claimed. The Martells of Dorne maintained a watchful neutrality, as they always had, waiting to see if a Targaryen might yet return across the sea. But that was another matter for another time. In Winterfell's Godswood, Robb Stark often walked alone among the ancient weirwood trees. He would kneel at the base of the heart tree, remembering the father who taught him honor, remembering the men he lost on the battlefield. Gray wind would pad silently beside him, ears perked at every distant rustle in the leaves. Sometimes, Robb would feel a presence there in the hush, as though his father's spirit lingered, or the old gods themselves watched him. He would whisper his doubts and regrets, acknowledging that the cost of kingship was high. But he took solace in the knowledge that the North was free. They had upheld their honor, forging an alliance with Stannis that proved to the realm that the North was no easy prey. He would think then of how precarious it could have been if Roose Bolton had decided otherwise, if that pale-eyed lord had chosen betrayal over loyalty. The memory of Bolton standing in the great hall of Riverrun, pledging House Bolton's swords to the king in the north, lingered in his mind. Robb knew that in war, a single choice could reshape the fate of kingdoms. House Bolton's loyalty had spared them the greatest tragedy imaginable and shifted the balance of power in Westeros. and so it was that the Red Wedding never happened. The Starks emerged battered but unbroken from the War of the Five Kings, forging a new age in the north. Robb Stark stood triumphant, yet humbled by the cost of victory. One day, perhaps, he might have heirs to carry on the legacy of the restored Kingdom of the North. For now, he was content to rebuild, to ensure the White Walkers beyond the Wall remained but a distant myth, or so he hoped. He set his mind to uniting the Northern Lords, including the Boltons, under a banner of strength. The rains had passed, and though winter was coming, the North was not alone. In this new history, travelers in the North might hear a song or a tale around a hearth. They might speak of the time House Bolton remained true, how the pale banner stood beside the gray direwolf, and how the young wolf marched to victory alongside his once feared bannermen. They would speak of the end of House Lannister's tyranny, the crowning of Stannis Baratheon as king on the Iron Throne, and the rise of Robb Stark as king in the North. Bards would note how no wedding feast was ever stained red by that treacherous act of betrayal that had haunted other stories. In the flicker of firelight, someone might say that, in the end, a single choice by a single man spared the realm a deeper horror, and while the war was still bloody and costly, it ended in a measure of justice. So the North stood free. Winterfell's gates were open to the families returning from distant battlefields, from hidden refuges, from captivity. In the training yard, new recruits practiced swordplay under the watchful eye of seasoned masters-at-arms. The sound of steel on steel rang through the corridors, reminding all who heard it that vigilance would forever be the price of independence. Men prayed to the old gods beneath the weirwood's red leaves, and in the great hall, the king in the north broke bread with his bannermen in a spirit of unity. The columns of ravens perched in the rookery, carrying messages to and from the far corners of the realm. If any new threat arose, Ironborn, Wildling, or even White Walker, the North would stand ready. They had survived the War of the Five Kings and emerged with their honor intact. In the months and years that followed, the realm changed in many ways, and yet in others it did not. Politics, rivalries, and old grudges never vanished completely, but for a time, the heartbreak of the previous war tempered the lords of Westeros. Fewer rushed to the battlefield again so readily. House Bolton quietly prospered under King Robb's rule, earning gold from its lands and respect from some quarters for the cunning it had shown. Though some wise men still cast wary glances at the flayed man's sigil, recalling stories of past cruelties, the official line was that House Bolton had proven its loyalty when it mattered most. That alone secured its place in the new kingdom. Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, remained a lurking figure, rumored to inflict punishments on Dreadfort's prisoners, but kept in check by his father's will and the watchful eye of the king. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon struggled to consolidate his reign in the south. King's Landing had been damaged by siege, and the people there remembered the Targaryens, the Baratheons, and the Lannisters all in different lights. The city watch had been purged of corruption, but new forms of corruption always threatened to creep in. With Cersei and Joffrey gone to meet their fates, Myrcella and Tommen were wards of the crown, possibly to be married off to other houses to secure alliances. The dawn of Stannis's reign was not an easy one, but his unwavering sense of duty and the counsel of men like Davos Seaworth allowed him to keep the realm together. Many saw him as a stern, unlovable king, but a just one, harsh but fair. And from time to time, King Stannis's court received envoys from the north. Lords, knights, or even the occasional maester might come bearing tidings of the cold beyond the wall, or trade updates, or expansions at White Harbor. Stannis would greet them with the same stony expression, but it was known he harbored a grudging respect for Robb Stark, the boy who had claimed kingship and retained it against the might of House Lannister. Although Stannis did not smile easily, he always gave the northern messengers a fair hearing, mindful of the pact that had ended the war. In the quiet corners of the Red Keep's library, new scribes wrote updated accounts of the War of the Five Kings. Their quills scratched at parchment, describing how it began with King Robert's death, how Joffrey claimed the throne, how Ned Stark was executed. They listed the battles and the shifting alliances, the rumors and the tragedies. But the scribes described, too, how House Bolton stood firm with the Starks, how they helped topple the Lannisters in the Riverlands, how they captured Tywin on the field and delivered him to justice. They recorded that the notorious Red Wedding never took place, that Walder Frey never dared cross the king in the north, lacking the whispered support of a treacherous Bolton alliance. And so the historians would note that a single twist of fate, a single choice, had spared thousands. Those same historians might mention, too, the heroic death of some northern lord or the savage triumph of an Umber or a Karstark. They might spin the story in ways that were more poetic than accurate, but the essence would remain. The north stood as a free kingdom, and Stannis Baratheon held the Iron Throne in the south. Over the centuries, the details of how exactly it all transpired might fade. Some would say it was the old gods who guided Roose Bolton's hand to remain loyal. Others would speculate that Roose saw some advantage unseen by lesser men. The bard's songs, of course, might elaborate on battles never fought or romances never kindled. But the truth was that House Bolton's loyalty changed the shape of the war entirely. As for King Robb Stark, he did not see himself as a legend or a mythic figure. He was simply a young man thrust into a position of power by circumstance and tragedy. He ruled from Winterfell with a keen awareness that every decision he made impacted thousands of lives. He kept the memory of his father and mother close to his heart. He cared for his sister Sansa, who eventually found a role in helping the northern ladies and forging ties with southern houses that might still come to visit. Letters from King's Landing or the Vale came from time to time, each a reminder that the world was bigger than the North alone. But the North was his responsibility, and so he accepted it fully. Sometimes, when the snows began to fall heavily, and the weirwood branches turned white with frost, Robb would look out from the walls of Winterfell and recall the dark days of the war, the horrors he had seen. He would reflect on all the might-have-beens. If the Boltons had turned on him, if the Red Wedding had taken place, if Walder Frey's malice had found nourishment in Lannister promises. In that reflection, he felt gratitude that fate had spared them. He felt a sense of humility, for he knew that even a king was not fully in control of his own destiny. But he also felt resolve because the North needed a strong and fair hand. He intended to be that hand, no matter the personal cost. And so the realm continued onward, shaped by new alliances and old enmities. The Watch on the Wall stood vigilant, with the men of the Night's Watch occasionally sending ravens warning of wildling gatherings beyond the Frost Fangs. There were rumors of shadows in the far north, of strange creatures glimpsed in the swirling snows. But for the moment, the War of the Five Kings was done, and the North rested in a rare peace. Robb Stark, king in the North, owed much of that peace to the quiet man from the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton, who had chosen loyalty over treachery. If ever that loyalty would be tested again, only the gods could say. But for now, at least, the winter winds that swept across the tundra brought a new era. One in which the Stark banner flew proudly over an independent North, untouched by the bloody betrayal that once stained the pages of an alternate history. And that is how House Bolton remained loyal to the Starks, averting the Red Wedding and forging an alliance between Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon that ultimately won the war against the Lannisters. The realm still bore scars, and families still mourned, but the North was free. The battered riverlands breathed again. King Stannis began his reign in King's Landing, austere and unyielding, but not without reason. And in Winterfell, the young wolf presided over a court that honored the old ways, forging a future that might just live up to the ideals for which his father died. In the end, that was more than many would have dared to hope for in such a bloody age, and though new challenges would one day arise, the memory of a world saved from the darkest betrayal lingered like a faint torch in the winter gloom.